share my screen with you and walk you through kind of a global look. We're going to go kind of much higher here. And hopefully what I'm going to show you is going to reassure you that you are not alone on the world stage, that the problems that California is grappling with are actually happening worldwide. And I want to introduce you to a couple of players that are operating in your housing markets that you might not be attending to. So here we go. So why is the United Nations interested in housing? In the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, passed by the then brand new United Nations, they include Article 25, which is a human right to housing. And that is Eleanor Roosevelt holding that declaration. Homelessness is now a global problem. I know we tend to think of it as a California and United States problem, but it's actually happening around the world. And it might surprise you who's having the problem. Australia has got a large problem. The United Kingdom has 260,000 people homeless. Canada, 129,000. Amsterdam, Seoul, and Barcelona are all experiencing huge homeless populations for their cities. Obviously, the United States at 540,000 people homeless, with Los Angeles at an incredible rate and New York City. Displacement is what causes homelessness globally, and we're going to show you how people get displaced. So the way the UN looks at housing is that it is stability, it is security, it is human dignity. It should not be a commodity. So in 2000, they appointed a UN special rapporteur on the adequate housing across the world. They took it on themselves to look into why we were seeing global housing shortages. And in 2019, they wrote a very formal letter, which I believe might have been forwarded to you from the United Nations. They wrote it to Blackstone, a massive worldwide investment company that's buying up a lot of housing. And they specifically identified the predatory practices of Blackstone as a major problem in displacing people and transforming housing markets to be far more expensive. So that works in the United States as well. It is not, again, Blackstone operates here, but so do others. Deutsche Bank is a notorious buyer of United States properties, particularly homes. And they have been very, very aggressive in the US market. And various magazines and news media that are focused on financial markets have been identifying this. And it's interesting, they see it as a problem. They definitely think that having a lot of your housing stock owned by investors, foreign and domestic or large investment companies, is a real problem. And that what it's doing is it's driving housing prices higher. So let's look a little bit here. There are 90,000 vacant homes in Los Angeles and 50,000 people experiencing homelessness. There is an anti-eviction mapping project that does a really good job drilling down data as to who owns what and where. This is California. As you can see, the areas of interest for investor-owned housing are Sacramento, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, not unexpectedly. And who are the big owners that have bought most of the housing that is investor-owned in these jurisdictions? And obviously Blackstone ranks right at the top of the list. So let's look a little bit around the world of what's going on, because I think you'll find that some of the same problems that we are focusing on here are being dealt with by other nations and cities. So Barcelona has a housing deficit of 170,000 homes, but they have 450,000 vacant homes. And Barcelona is a very dense city. If you've ever been there, it's lovely. And one of the things that really cropped up for them was in the 2010s, it felt like a lot of their housing stock went to vacation rental. And they got really upset about it. It ushered in kind of a whole new political era there. And so what they've done is they've implemented vacancy taxes and second home taxes. And they've actually started fining people for leaving flats empty. And you can see here to the right, again, who's a major player in Spain right now is Blackstone. So that's one of the things that they've done. That didn't seem to fix it. So they've actually gone further. And their mayor, who is really fierce, has decided that they're going to look at repossessing corporate properties that are left vacant by investors. Berlin. 80% of 4 million Berliners rent their homes. The city tried to rent freeze during the pandemic to stop residents from being forced out, and a federal court in Germany overturned that. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like something that would happen in the United States? But people have been looking at who owns Berlin that's driving these costs up. And so what's happening there is a lot of investor-owned buildings, and sometimes they're not even in the nice neighborhoods. Again, here's Blackstone operating in the city of Kreuzberg. And what they've been doing is they've been buying these properties. Sometimes they'll do minimal renovations, sometimes not. But they will do no fault evictions, which we are all very familiar with here, and bring in people that pay 3 times what the former tenants were paying. In London, this is another place where housing has become just ridiculously unaffordable to own. And part of the problem that London identified was, again, foreign investors that were doing buy to leave investments. They would just buy a property, a building, an apartment, a flat, leave it and expect a price appreciation, and then maybe turn it over in the future. A lot of second home investments. This is also a California issue, where there are 46,000 second homes in London, but the government's not even very good at tracking those. Airbnb is also a huge problem, and London is reported to have the largest short-term rental market of any European city, with at least 75,000 units for Airbnb. Going to Asia, Seoul, Korea has seen the same housing spike that sounds really familiar to us, their property is now 14 times their average household income, and it has pushed low and middle income families out of the market. It's causing a lot of political upheaval. What you see here is vacant and abandoned homes that are going to be developed into these towers, but you will have to wonder if the residents of these homes are going to ever be able to live in here, or is this going to be much more expensive housing? And Seoul has taken an approach, which is to look at taking something similar that we've been looking at in California. Why don't we look at taking over some hotels, make some studios? Let's see if we can do something to ease this crunch. Their housing prices have risen 50% since 2017. New Zealand also has a horrible homeless crisis and housing crisis. And this is a scene that looks very familiar to those of us in California. They have tried various things to kind of put the brakes on this sort of runaway housing speculative increase in prices. But what's happened is that it's not worked, and they've seen a 30% spike in just this past year. So I think one of the things that we don't look at as much in California, we look a lot on the supply side and on the bureaucratic side, and how do we get housing constructed, but we're not looking at the role that investors are taking in our markets. And this really kind of started in 2008 with the Great Recession. This is when a lot of the major investment firms decided the thing to do would be to buy up housing. And like I've mentioned, Blackstone and Deutsche Bank are two of the biggest. The pandemic had an interesting effect of warping and distorting the housing market even further, in that it overheated our stock markets. So investors did not want to put more money into an overheated stock market, so they really plowed heavily into housing. And that has made housing markets very speculative now. Everybody here knows stories of people who tried to bid for a home and were immediately outbid, to the tune of, 50,000 more, could not even get near that price. And a lot of banks and investors are paying straight up cash for these units. So it is a global problem. It is not just unique to California, even though we are feeling the protracted pain of it. Others are there with us. When we do profitizing of housing, we make a lot more displacement. Like I mentioned, families cannot compete against Blackstone and Deutsche Bank. Institutional investors have a habit of using no-fault evictions to displace tenants, and they make higher rents for the new tenants. So lower income families get pushed further and further out, again, something we're very familiar with in California, to afford housing. But some just go to their cars and they're hoping for better conditions. So when we do displacement of people, we also increase homelessness. And that's a big sign something's wrong in our housing market. But as you see, it's wrong in housing markets worldwide. So here's what some jurisdictions are doing to thwart the movement of financialization and privatization of their housing. So I don't know if you know, but Canada has an election coming up this month. It's a federal election. This is the big issue for their election. They've decided that they are going to, or they're promising to, ban foreign investment in Canadian homes, and they're going to end the practice of blind bidding, where you don't know what the other bidder bid against you. Holland had a news story today, actually, that they are going to ban the sales of new or recently sold low and mid-price homes to investors for at least 4 years. Berlin, their movement, again, they're having an election this month. They got 350,000 signatures for a referendum named the Deutsche Wohnen referendum, as they have identified Deutsche Bank as their problem. They're looking to seize apartments from corporations that own more than 3,000 units, and they want to turn them over to newly created public housing agencies. London is making a move to ban no-fault evictions. And China recently, in the last month, increased their mortgage rates. They accelerated development of their government subsidized rental housing, and they have placed increasing scrutiny on developers and investment firms with an eye to the newly listed homes. So in the US and California, we've kind of, in this session, you probably know that Senate Bills 9 and 10 passed last week in the Assembly. And this was a very contested piece of legislation, both of them. They were aimed at gently increasing density by allowing either 4 units on a single family lot split into 2 lots, or allowing up to 10 to 14 units on a single family lot. And a lot of this was draped in rhetoric where it went very polarized very quickly, right? There were some that said single family zoning is just racist. There are other people who said, well, that's great, but we're not having a luxury housing crisis. And that seems to be a lot of what gets built. There were questions from, communities about, hey, what about climate change and our resources and water? Where are we going to get that if we're going to just densify our neighborhoods? And there was kind of an attitude, especially in the Twitter sphere, when things got really polarized of, just build more, it'll trickle down. And the feeling was, no, it's not going to. And the polling on this was wildly unpopular, with 60 to 75% of people opposed to Senate Bill 9 and 10. Now, the governor is doing some great things on this front, right? So Project Home Key and Room Key, this is policy genius, taking buildings that went dead in the pandemic, which were hotels, repurposing them, using them to house our people experiencing homelessness. That was brilliant. He's done a historic and precedent-setting investment of $12 billion of this year's budget into housing and homelessness. The state has eviction moratorium that went beyond what feds allowed during the pandemic. We did pandemic stimulus funds to our neediest families, rental assistance to help keep people housed. And, there are legislative bills on his desk. There are some that are good, some that are not great, but we can do better. So we are the world's 5th largest economy. It would be natural that we are feeling the pain that the rest of the world is feeling on the housing front. It would be astonishing if we weren't. Isn't there an opportunity here to maybe pull all the stakeholders really from across the spectrum together and thoughtfully consider possible solutions that would work best for California? I know that this committee is very focused on that, and I'm very grateful that you have taken this interest. So there's sort of 3 policy buckets of solutions that we can look at. One is, let's just start to protect our people. Let's recognize housing as a human right. Some countries have written this into their constitution. We are not one of them. Families and residents really need to be given first priority in bidding for a home. I don't know how we make that happen, but somehow or another, we have to mute or mitigate the effect of the institutional investor just straight out overbidding everyone who's trying to get into a home. We need to strengthen mitigation provisions in our no-fault evictions. I believe right now we have 1 month of relocation assistance. My city, Santa Barbara, does 2 months of relocation assistance. We need to mandate mitigation for any development that's going to displace current residents. Every time we take over, some dilapidated housing and we decide we're going to build luxury units on it, where do those residents that were living there go? Where's the housing for them? Second bucket of solutions is to curb the impacts of the institutional investors. And there are countries, like you've seen, that are trying this. So you can look at banning foreign investment in domestic homes. We could look at second home and vacancy taxes and fines. Barcelona and Vancouver have both implemented these, and they use the money to fund affordable housing. If we would just take vacation rental off the market, we would have done an immediate return of supply of housing to the market. Workforce housing, Aspen did this, and I think it's brilliant. Every time you build a luxury home in Aspen, you're required to put money into workforce housing. Why? Because your luxury home created demands for workers, and they need to live somewhere. So cities could fund workforce housing projects with fees like this. And the final bucket of solutions is, how do we get to the supply side? How do we get to more of the affordable housing? And there were some very good things that came through in the pandemic that we really liked. So Senate Bill 15 was a great bill. I'm not sure it's going to survive, but it allowed you to take a dead big box retail store like a dead Best Buy. We have 3 of them in Santa Barbara, a Sears and a Macy's and a Nordstrom. And it would give you sales tax relief and grants to help you build affordable housing in those units. Senate Bill 6 looked for a similar situation for vacant office space. Senate Bill 621, I think, is dead on arrival, but another good idea, converting dead motels into homeless housing. And then I think we need to look at solutions like creating zoning and fast paths for tiny home villages. This is a kind of new area of housing. There are a lot of people that like it. It works really well also for homelessness, but we don't really have zoning that allows it. And we have no neighborhoods that probably want it. And I forgot to mention the first solution here is that we have public lands. They are owned by agencies like our school districts, our state government, some of our cities and counties own public lands. We should require that those be used to develop affordable housing. We have something going on in Santa Barbara where one of our public agencies is planning to develop market rate and luxury homes on their unit. It's a publicly owned lot. It feels like to me it should be used for the betterment of the public. So there you go. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm happy to entertain any questions that you might have.
Thank you for your testimony, Ms. Byrne. Did we have any questions from any of the commissioners? I'm not seeing any, so it's very thorough testimony.
So, right.
Oh, we have Commissioner Erner.
So this was fascinating testimony, by the way. Thank you so much for being willing to share it with us. This is the first time, I guess, I've realized that the housing problem is an international problem, right? I mean, I guess I've always just kind of focused it on the US. And so the question is besides the Blackstones and the Deutsche Bank, I mean, I understand the institutional, that I understand, but are we also having just housing production problem in the world? Is there not enough lumber? Are there problems because of climate change, right? All of these other things that are happening, right? Because I don't, historically in the United States, for example, we didn't start really having a homeless problem that we all noticed, right? There've always been homeless people, all right? During the 1930s, there were, people who rode the railroads, blah, 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 right? But it's starting at around 1980 when the federal government kind of pulled out of housing, if I remember correctly. All of a sudden, we started noticing people on the streets. And so, but now you're talking about that it's a worldwide problem, and it's not just, right? And so what are the commonalities across, besides Deutsche Bank, besides the institutions doing this, right? Are there other commonalities of issues, right? I mean, is climate change changing something? The great divide between the rich and the poor, that kind of thing. Are there other commonalities that stand out in regards to why this is happening worldwide?
Yes and no. I mean, obviously the world is huge and there's a lot of diversity in it. So it's totally not one size fits all. But you just noticed, right, that even in an economy like China, where things are very centrally planned, right, and that all aspects of the economy are very much managed, even they are running into this problem where and their feeling was it's investor-driven speculation that is the root cause of their issue. Looking at Europe in particular, they've long had a model of socialized housing, and it's not quite the same thing as public housing in America, that we have kind of a different definition than they do. But their socialized housing especially featured mixing of populations, right? And obviously some of these cities are extremely dense, so you sort of run out of the room, right? Which is why I think it's useful to look at some of the repurposing solutions where, the pandemic opened some things up that weren't there before. And obviously that's the route that Seoul, Korea is taking, right? Like, let's take hotels and convert them into studios, right? Because that's a place to get housing where there is none today, by repurposing something that maybe doesn't suit what the community needs as much as housing would. And I too am very surprised by the spikes in homelessness across the world. My parents, my family's all British. Typically the UK takes care of you from cradle to grave. So to see so many people sleeping rough, as they call it, is a little shocking, that what is going on. One of the other problems that they have is some of the socialized housing is being bought out and controlled by investors.
Right, well, I think it started under Margaret Thatcher. I mean, Margaret was not, I gather, fascinated by the social housing models that had been developed, I think, after World War I, actually, when the soldiers came back and they needed housing.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Okay.
Yeah. And I think too, in all the countries across the world, very similar to what's happened in the United States, I think you probably remember around the 1980s when you were buying a house, the formula was 2.5 times your income. That's what you could afford, right? So you saw from Seoul, Korea, and other, like when housing moves 14 times away, from your income, and your wages don't keep pace, right, which also is a worldwide problem, then it becomes ever more unaffordable, and you really can't get at the social or the affordable housing tier at the bottom there and build it up fast enough to catch up. You just can't, right? So that's part of the problem too, I think.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, I have Commissioner Emerson, then Commissioner Sidley.
In the past, we've always had a lot of discussion about infill housing. Is that still on the horizon for more progress in building in infill areas?
Yeah, I think so. And I think a lot of countries are doing a lot of infill, right? Especially in some of their urban cores. I will say, though, one of the things that's a little distressing about the infill and then the density argument is there are two key cities, which is Hong Kong and Vancouver, who both obviously have gone for incredible density, right? You're going to live in a 60-story tower in Hong Kong, right? I mean, that's going to be your sort of only option. And yet they have some of the highest housing prices still in the world. So we're seeing from them some 20 years down the road after the densification, and infill experience, it still didn't drop the price of housing enough. I don't think you can get at it from just a supply side argument. I think you have to get at it from how do you protect your citizens, your residents, your people from being pushed out by forces that don't care about how much you build. I mean, they just don't. And as you can see from very dense cities like London, right, having a huge vacation rental by owner stock is a huge problem for them. Amsterdam has the same problem. And that's another very dense city with zero infill potential at this point, right? Because they've built everything in already.
Thank you.
So my question actually is about the topic that you just touched on, and that is vacation rentals. So how obviously the homeless crisis here in Los Angeles is just growing exponentially. And so I am wondering, based on data, how much of that do we believe is based on, product being taken off the market for these vacation rentals? And then has anyone thought about, I know if you're a hotel, there's hotel taxes, things like that people who are renting their home aren't necessarily paying all of that. And have people thought about doing something like, a concept like the taxi medallion? And if you want to rent, you have to get the taxi medallion. And particularly if you are a unit of 4 or less, which is usually what the home would have been, a small apartment or something like that, then, and so you would still have to pay all the other fees. And is anybody even looking at trying to curb some of this vacation rental that's causing some of the problems?
Yeah, very good question. So obviously that's Barcelona's direction, right? Barcelona is going to go very hard in that direction, that they don't like the vacation rental. They're going to put a lot of taxes. A lot of the European cities, that is their first move. If you're going to do a second home, vacation rental, whatever, we're going to jack your tax rate really high. And I think that's fair. If you're monetizing something, right, then and if it's a business, you would pay a lot of business taxes anyway. Why wouldn't you pay it in this regard? So I think that's a fair, way of going about things. And some cities are further along in that than others. Like I say, Vancouver's ordinance is extremely well developed on this. So is Barcelona's. So I think that's one, and Paris is trying something quite similar, but I don't think theirs is as robust. And obviously London needs to get it together. So some cities are trying things like this. I'm not entirely sold that vacation rental is a business model that we should just continue to support and allow. I feel like if we did ban it, that people that are interested in doing that would get extremely creative and build hotels that look like homes, right? So that people would want to rent them out. I'm not confident of that. Where I live in Santa Barbara, we zoned vacation rentals into R4. We do no enforcement. If they don't bother to register for a license, the city basic, and it's fair because there's one poor employee there, right, who says, can you prove to me? Can you show me video? Can you show me the VRB? So you have to do all the investigation yourself as a neighbor. And I will tell you, the neighborhood that I live in was formerly low rent, kind of a working class, really down on its heels kind of neighborhood. And now I'm staring at 6 vacation rentals. Where did the families in those homes go? I don't know. but I know that they can't afford to live here. And my rent doubled as a result over 10 years of living in kind of this upzoned, vacation rental neighborhood. So I'm not convinced vacation rental is good for citizens, good for cities, great for housing. I feel like it's a problematic sharing economy business model that I think's got a lot of kinks to be worked out. And I don't really know anybody who's really on top of their A game on this.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Byrne. I'm not seeing any further questions from commissioners. So thank you very much for your testimony. It was a different perspective and something I think will be valuable to our study. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.